Hello and welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host, Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Samuels. So Phil is a strength and conditioning coach working with the US Air Force based in the UK, and he's previously worked in elite football, making him the perfect person today to discuss how you can improve your recovery using basic techniques. So without further ado, it's time to welcome him onto the show. So Phil, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yes, absolutely. Hey, I'm Phil, and I have a full-time role as a strength and conditioning coach for the US Air Force. Alongside this, I work on a consultant basis for Oxford University. I have bachelor's in exercise science, master's degree in nutrition, worked in professional football for a few years before picking up these roles, and then have my own consultancy business on the side as well.
Absolutely excellent. That's a lot of stuff. Yeah. Oh, there's another one.
I do a little bit of guest lecturing too, but not loads of that. Just kind of on an ad hoc basis.
It's a lot of things to fit into a week, month, or a year. But it's impressive that you managed to do it.
Yeah, it's good fun. I love it, to be honest with you. So, it's a little bit easier when you love what you do, and I'm quite happy doing it.
Excellent, mate. Excellent. Obviously, we're here to discuss recovery. So, before we get into like the real meat and potatoes of that, can you take us through what recovery is and why it's important?
100%. So recovery basically refers to the amount of time that it takes for the body to return to its basically like homeostasis or into a recovered state, so that the athlete or player is ready to then go for the next session. Depending on how long it is in between those sessions may dictate the protocols that you use and where you might put your priority if you've got maybe hours between sessions or minutes between sessions, or if you've got a couple of days, it may look very different as to how you'd approach that recovery.
And what kind of systems then need to recover? Because you said homeostasis, that's kind of the whole body, but the homeostasis can apply to obviously all those different systems as well. So what kind of different systems are we talking about here? Is it mental? Is it physical? Is it muscle? Is it tendon? What's going on here?
Yeah, 100%, pretty much all of the above. So obviously you've got muscular, neural, cardiovascular. Another one that often gets overlooked is your immune system. I think for anyone who's worked within a team sport setting, one of the biggest reasons, aside from injury, as to why athletes or players might miss time for training or competition is through illness. So if you're able to reduce that time through making sure that the immune system's getting back up to full strength as quickly as possible, then 100%. And then psychological as well, but I'm not a massive, I don't know loads about psychology, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. I think that's a completely different area to the other ones.
Oh, we've got a podcast on that too, so you should be all good if you type that one in somewhere. But
happy days.
When it comes to them recovery, so we want to get those systems back to ready as quickly as possible, right? Like, is that the general gist of what we want to do on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis?
Yeah, 100%. It will be, so obviously athletes will need to recover from either training or competition or injury. So it will be making sure that they're getting back to that point where they're able to go and then train or compete again at an optimal level and able to perform at the levels that are required on a consistent basis. It's quite easy to recover from just one session if you've then got a week in between them. But for athletes at the top end of their sport, they're going to be having maybe 2 sessions a day, maybe 3 a day, most days of the week. So how does it look to make sure they're able to perform in every single one of them sessions?
And when it comes to then good recovery, like what does that look like? So before we get onto like the methods of recovering, like what are the markers of someone who's then recovered?
Yeah. So markers wise, you'd be looking at like heart rate variability. You could look at creatine kinase markers if you had a little bit more of a lab setting. But for a lot of people, for athletes, you may be looking at like muscle soreness, very easy one to look at. And general, if you're doing a wellness questionnaire for an athlete, then how fatigued are they feeling can just be an easy question to give you a general idea as a practitioner. Off the get-go.
And when it comes to those, like you mentioned creatine kinase, for example, which is a lab-based thing, so most people probably wouldn't have access to that, but heart rate and heart rate variability, how do you then use that to determine how well someone's recovered?
For sure. So you've been looking at the heart rate variability. Obviously, the greater the heart rate variability, then more often than not, you'd be assuming that the recovery from there would be a little bit better. And then within resting heart rates, you could get that if they're using any technology overnight from sleep data. Higher resting heart rates may indicate that there's some underlying physiological stress that the athlete may not have recovered quite as well from. But yeah, we'll cover a little bit more on that on the sleep section.
Excellent. So then what are the big hitters when it comes to recovering properly? So let's say we've got athletes who are like, right, well, I do want to recover properly. I want to make sure that I'm ready for my next training session, I'm ready for the game, whatever. What are the big hitters when it comes to recovering properly?
Yeah, so in my opinion, based on the research that I've read, there's three main pillars. Sleep would be number one, and then nutrition and hydration would then be your other two. So they would be the main three pillars that I would try and hit every single time. And from that, with sleep, there's some research out there to suggest that athletes will need more sleep than the general population. So everyone's heard like get your 8 hours, but that's more applied for a general population setting. Whereas for athletes, you may look at between 9 to 10 hours, per night to optimize their recovery from a sleep perspective. And then when you're looking at hydration, that's massively dependent on how soon the next session is. So as a general rule of thumb, the research suggests that about 1.5 times body weight lost would be an appropriate amount as a volume, and then the speed of that basically is dependent on whenever the next session is, whether you're looking at ideally 2 to 4 hours, but if you don't have that much time, then within like 60 minutes, and you need to add some sodium to it. But we can cover that a little bit more in a sec if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think let's dig into the sleep stuff first. So we take it one by one, right? So
Yeah.
You said that athletes might need more sleep. Like, what happens if they don't get it then? Like, let's say that they needed 9 to 10, but we don't really know that because we can't really just pluck that out of thin air. So, say they needed it and they didn't get it and they're tired. Like, what can they do then to improve that the next time?
Yeah. So from the sleep side of things, there's a few things that practitioners can do to kind of aid this for their athletes. Number one would be sleep extension. This could look like in the form of having team naps. That's something that's coming in, and I remember there was an article put out about Tottenham introducing this in the first team setting. So that can structured naps throughout the day, potentially around training session or in between training sessions. Maybe something that helps get them that additional extra sleep. If you have an athlete that you know is chronically undersleeping, then they may need a little bit more. If it's just athletes are feeling a little bit tired, then you'll probably be looking somewhere in the 20 to 30 minute range. And then the guys that may need even more than that, you'd then want to go up to 90 minutes, but you wouldn't want to cut them off in between that 30 to 90-ish minute window, because then you're just looking into like their REM cycles, basically.
And what does that then mean? Because I think that's important for athletes to understand. It seems intuitive that more is better, but if you're like, well, actually 30 minutes was kind of optimal, how do they know then when to cut off, and why is it then different between those two cut-off points?
Yeah. So the 30 minutes would be, let's say you're getting 8 hours ish sleep at night, and you feel like you just need a little bit of a boost, then that would be when I'd recommend having around a 20-30 minute nap. If let's say you had a poor night's sleep, especially if you're working with older athletes, if they've got newborn kids, family, life may be going on around it, and they're looking at the 4 to 5 hour range overnight, then in that regard, I'd be looking to try and get 90 minutes in during the day.
So it's like a full on sleep. Like 90 minutes is a long time.
Yeah, it is a long time, but it is also something that would be worth prioritizing if it's not possible to get it in overnight. I don't think it's worth pushing a habit of taking a nap all the time. If it's possible to get it in enough sleep in that one block overnight, that should be the absolute priority. But if that's not possible, then looking at naps can be another way to go about it. Another method that people can use to help improve their sleep quality would be their sleep hygiene. So from this, it's basically your habits around what you do before you go to bed, and then when you wake up. So before bed, we'd be looking at blue light before they're going to sleep. How can you reduce this? There's been a couple of papers that have come out looking at either video games or being on their phones about 60 minutes before, and the differences that that's had on sleep outcomes. And basically, the earlier you can turn off any devices, the better outcomes come on sleep, which sounds obvious, but sometimes trying to get that message through can be a little bit more difficult. And it may be something that if as a practitioner that you go at over multiple days or months rather than just doing one workshop and being like, it's done.
Yeah. And you mentioned nutrition as well. So what are the key nutrition things which athletes should be doing to recover fully?
Yeah. So from a nutritional side of things, your post-session, the main focus will need to be carbohydrate intake. And more often than not, athletes are very aware that protein, recovery, everything like that. But within them first couple of hours, glycogen resynthesis rates are significantly higher than if you wait 2 to 3 hours, which is why it would be recommended that you try and get around 1 to 1.2 gram per kilogram of carbohydrates per hour in the first couple of hours post-exercise. Now, how this can look practically will depend on what you have available to you. So for me personally, a rule that I like is the 30-30-30 rule. So 30 grams of carbs, 30 grams of protein inside 30 minutes. And that was something that I found athletes could remember quite well. And it can look something as easy as like a chocolate milk and a cereal bar, for example. So that initially, and then the replacing carbohydrate needs can look like your basically a large portion of your carbohydrates. So your pastas, rice, potatoes, etc. And then throughout the day, this will depend on what your athlete's body composition goals are, everything like that. Around 1.6 to 2.2 gram per kilogram of protein per day, and this would you'd want to ideally get that in around within 4 windows throughout the day.
Excellent. And the hydration. So the last one that you mentioned, obviously, yeah, good example. Tricking away. So hydration comes in there as well, and I think that's an easy one to forget because, yeah, it's like sleep and food is the obvious. Like, all right, I need to sleep, I need to go to bed, I need to eat, but hydration can kind of slip away and not be seen quite as easily because, yeah, if you're not thirsty, you just crack on with it. And especially at temperatures like we are at the moment, like I'm sitting here sweating. Hydration plays a big role, right? So, what can you do to improve your hydration status?
So I think the biggest question as a practitioner or an athlete really is, when is my next session? Because if you have a long time, by a long time, I'm talking the session isn't until the next day, then the need for a rapid rehydration strategy decreases. Whereas if you have a session let's say you have a morning session, so you're up at 8, you have a 90-minute session, so it's now 9:30 in the morning, you've got another one at 3-4 o'clock, then that within that window, you may be looking at how can I get rehydrated as quickly as possible. So the first thing that you'd want to know is roughly how much body weight have I lost through sweat within that session. Now, as you said, at the minute, it's really hot. So especially if you've got athletes within a pre-season window, temperatures are normally higher. It may be that they're sweating way more. So in that regard, they would need to be drinking way more. So 1.5 times the body weight lost is a good area to start. Now, for a rehydration, if possible, milk-based beverages would be the priority on this. That's because there's obviously the fluids, you get some carbohydrates, you get some proteins and some electrolytes all within it. Whereas for some people, they're unable to have these drinks due to lactose requirements or anything like that, then a carbon protein mix with some added sodium would be where you'd want to go with it. So what you're looking for, more often than not, water is inadequate for a rapid rehydration strategy. If you only have water with you, then try and add some salt to that. So basically what the salt will do will decrease the amount of fluid that you urinate out, basically, and from that, because you have an increase in water retention, you rehydrate a little bit better.
And I'm rudely interrupting to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, what you have to do is hit the link in the show notes and you get into the Coach Academy completely for free for the next 7 days. So hit that link when the podcast is finished. So when it comes to then, obviously, like the top of the top, so elite level athletes, let's assume they're doing all the things you just mentioned really well. It's not always the case, I know, but let's assume they're doing all of that.
Yep.
What kind of additional recovery methods can be used, which then have good scientific underpinnings? Because obviously, like everyone can come out with a product and say this improves recovery, but like, what's the stuff which will improve recovery if you're already doing the basics and is evidence-based?
Yep. So from this, I would take a little bit more of an individualized approach. So you have active and passive recovery methods. So your active recovery methods in between a session, the mechanism suggests that it's basically some light exercise that improves lactate removal due to an increase in blood flow. The evidence on this is inconclusive. Now, there has been some papers that suggest that there is a significant difference. There's been some papers suggest that there's been no effect, and there's been a couple of papers that came out and said that there can be a detrimental effect. So mainly, in my opinion, just from the practical side of things, the detrimental effect comes in when the active recovery basically becomes another session and is way too difficult. But that it is something that can benefit athletes, but it won't work for everyone. So from this, I would suggest trying it with an athlete, but I wouldn't enforce it on absolutely everyone. And then from the passive recovery, one that I would definitely recommend would be like compression garments post-exercise. So the main thing on the passive recovery side of things, so you've got basically like your compression garments, you have a few other bits. So 1 second, let me just go through my notes. So you've got like foam rolling, massage, and then cold water immersion as well. So for the foam rolling and the massage and compression, the evidence suggests that they do no harm, which is the main thing that you want as a practitioner. And then from there, the evidence is kind of inconclusive as to whether they significantly improve recovery. A lot of them will reduce the feeling of DOMS within athletes. So if you'll reduce that feeling of DOMS, then for a lot of athletes, that kind of is their marker of recovery. Although it isn't technically one of like the physiological markers, if an athlete doesn't feel quite as sore, they'll often psychologically think that they're ready to go and play again.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, as a former young person who didn't have a background in sports science, it's like, well, I feel good, so crack on. And sometimes we don't need to worry too much about it, but there's obviously some sneaky neural fatigue in there as well, which might play a role. But when it comes to then the equipment necessary for this, you've mentioned a few different things there. Do aspiring athletes or athletes need like high level, expensive equipment to do this with, or can they just do like cheap versions?
I wouldn't say that expensive equipment isn't an absolute must. Like, if let's take foam rolling, for example, like foam rolling is foam rolling. And that you could link that with like your massage guns and everything in that kind of bracket, in that it won't do you any harm. It may help your recovery, and it doesn't have to be stupidly expensive. So a foam roller you could probably pick up for about £15. If you wanted to spend a little bit more on a massage gun, then you absolutely could. But I wouldn't recommend spending all this money if you're not sleeping right, you're not eating well, and you're not like rehydrating. Do them 3 first. And I would recommend spending the money on good quality produce at the supermarket over a massage gun. I think that would give you more chance of having better physiological adaptations rather than just laying on a foam roller for 20 minutes a day.
So when performing these kind of like extra modalities, let's say you've got the basics in order, are there any disadvantages to throwing these in? So, like, obviously time wasting, it doesn't do any harm, but are there any other potentially disadvantageous things which might be going on there?
I'd say one that might be worth being a little bit cautious on would be cold water immersion or ice baths. Obviously, it's very popular on Instagram at the minute, and there's a lot of people claiming huge health benefits, recovery benefits, everything else. From what I've read, the evidence doesn't back this up, and there's not a huge body of evidence on this either. From what I've read, the evidence is suggesting that the cold water immersion may attenuate hypertrophy gains, so it may blunt the response over a longer term. And for a long-term use of ice baths, I probably wouldn't recommend it. And again, they're quite time-consuming. And yeah, I would say that they're probably the only ones that would have a negative effect in a long-term environment.
So if you were to do an ice bath after every strength session, for example, then you might eventually start to lose some gains, or at least not get the gains which you could have had initially.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily like losing gain. I just think that it doesn't allow for that recovery process to come in because of the suppression of the inflammation, and because of that, you don't allow you don't give the body the chance to adapt as well as it possibly could.
So you kind of remove the stimulus, right? Like they worked hard to get a stimulus, but the stimulus hasn't quite worked yet. It still needs to be adapted to.
Yeah.
And if you take it away immediately, then they're not going to get the same level of adaptation.
Yeah, exactly. You basically blunt any of the response that you would have got from the training that you've pushed really hard in. So, yeah, I wouldn't personally recommend that. If you're in a tournament setting where you have a really short period of time to recover, it may be beneficial, but even then, I'm not sure it would be the first thing I'd go towards.
Excellent. I think it's a really interesting insight. So when we bring all of this together, what do athletes do to improve their recovery? Obviously, people are going to do different things, different athletes, different stuff, but have you got any examples of how you've used these methods previously with athletes to improve their recovery?
I think for some of the best athletes that I've worked with have very clear routines on what they do after training, after competition, and they stick to their routines. So they're very clear on what they need to do and they don't try and make it up as they go along. So, for example, they know that within the first 30 minutes post-training or competition, they're going to have a chocolate milkshake and a protein bar, for example, and then an hour post-session, they have their main meal that they've prepped and bought in or is provided by the club or the venue or whatever. And then 3 or 2 hours post, they eat again, for example. Alongside each of their meals, they make sure that they're trying to drink a milk-based drink, and if they can't drink that, and then their sleep hygiene is good, and they allocate enough time in bed to get the required amounts of sleep, rather than knowing that they've got to be up at 7 o'clock to get to training and they're going to bed at midnight. They're in bed at, let's say, 8:30, 9 o'clock, and with the alarm going off at 7.
So that makes a big difference as well. So, yeah, getting potentially 10 hours as opposed to 7, that's a large difference between the two.
Yeah, I would say that it would be the small things that are done consistently well that add up over time that distinguishes those who are good and those who are very good, rather than those who are very good have access to something that everyone else doesn't have. I personally don't agree with that.
I think that's a really interesting insight. So in terms of like summing that all up, can you give us a quick 30-second summary of all of those tips which you've just given as like an extensive list of tips, but like if you were to really just narrow this down into like the shortest piece of advice, what would you advise athletes to?
Advice would be rehydrate with milk if you can. Eat as close after a session as you can, a main meal that's balanced with a big carbohydrate source, and then make sure that you are eating enough throughout the day and sleeping enough, and you give yourself enough time to sleep each night.
Excellent. Phil, massive thanks for your time and effort. It's been a pleasure talking. Where can people find a little bit more about you?
So LinkedIn is just Phil Samuel. And then I'm on Instagram as well, which is PSA_performance. They're kind of my two platforms that I'm a little most active on.
Fantastic. So massive thanks for your time and effort. It's been a pleasure talking, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Top man, thank you.
And that's it once again. A massive thanks to Phil for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes so you can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days using that link. And what's more, every time you complete one of the courses, you get a certificate of completion to prove your ongoing education. And if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon of Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.